The morning of my mother's funeral, I wore her favorite color, dusty rose. She always said it made me look like myself, whatever that meant when I was younger. Now I understood. She meant it made me look like I belonged to her. I hadn't seen her in 11 years, not because I didn't love her, not because I stopped trying, but because loving my mother and staying in that house had become two things that couldn't exist in the same space anymore. And the person who made sure of that was standing 40 feet away from me right now, in a dark gray suit, accepting condolences from people who had no idea what he was. My father. I watched him shake hands, nod slowly, press his lips together in that way he always did when he wanted to look dignified. He'd perfected that expression. He'd had decades to practice it. I hadn't planned on coming back to Kelowna when my aunt called me, my mother's younger sister, the only person from that world who still had my number. She didn't say much. Just, "Your mother passed early this morning. The service is Saturday. I think she'd want you there." And then, after a pause, "I think you might want to be there too." She was right on both counts. My husband, Seth, had driven us from Vancouver, 7 hours. He'd offered to fly, but I said no. I needed the time. Needed to watch the landscape change. Needed to count the kilometers between who I was now and who I used to be when I lived inside that grief. I was 22 when I left. Not dramatically. No screaming match. No door slam so hard the walls shook. Just a Tuesday morning when my father sat me down at the kitchen table and explained, in the same tone he used for everything, calm, certain, immovable, that he had made arrangements, that the house would be refinanced, that I would sign the paperwork transferring my share of my grandmother's inheritance, the money Gran had left specifically for me in her will, to a family account he controlled. He called it consolidating resources. He said it was what responsible families did. I was 22. I was in my second year at UBC Okanagan. I had a part-time job at a coffee shop on Pandosy Street, and I thought I understood money. But I didn't. Not really, not the way you understand it after you've had it taken from you. I asked if I could read the documents first. He said there wasn't time. I asked if I could call Gran's lawyer. He said that wasn't necessary. I asked my mother with my eyes the way daughters ask their mothers things they can't say out loud, and she looked down at her coffee cup. She looked at it for a long time. I signed. I don't know why. I'm still ashamed of that. I've talked about it in therapy. I've turned it over 100 times, and I still feel it. That particular shame of being young and not knowing yet that you're allowed to say no to your own father. That family is not a good enough reason to hand someone everything your grandmother wanted you to have. $46,000. That's what Gran left me. Enough for a down payment she'd written in the letter that came with the will. So you'll always have somewhere to stand. My father consolidated it into the family account in March. By September, I was gone. I didn't leave because of the money. Or I did, but not in the way you'd think. I left because of what happened after. Because once I'd signed, something shifted in how he looked at me. Like I'd proven something he'd always suspected, that I could be moved, that if he applied the right pressure in the right place, I'd give. And once he knew that, he couldn't stop testing it. Little things at first. Decisions about my degree program. Comments about Seth, who I'd been dating for 6 months, who my father called a distraction without ever having sat across from him for more than a meal. Rules about when I came home and what time the lights went off and why I was on the phone so late. And then one evening in September, my father told me I should break up with Seth. Not suggested. Told. I looked at him and something went very quiet inside me. Not angry quiet. Just clear. The way water goes clear when it finally settles. I moved out the following weekend. I took my clothes, my textbooks, my grandmother's jewelry box, and the letter she'd written me that I'd read so many times, the creases had gone soft. I left my key on the kitchen table. My mother stood in the doorway. She didn't stop me. I don't think she could have, but she said, and this is a thing I've carried with me for 11 years. She said, "I know, sweetheart. I know, that was all." But it was enough. It was her telling me she understood, even if she couldn't follow. I finished my degree. Seth and I got a small apartment in Kitsilano. I worked, he worked. We built something slow and sturdy in hours. He went back to school for his second designation. He's a forensic accountant now, works primarily with the provincial crown on financial fraud investigations. We got married in 2019 in a small ceremony at a winery in the Fraser Valley. My aunt came. Gran's old friend, who'd known me since I was 4, came. My parents did not. I sent my mother cards. Birthday, Christmas, Mother's Day. I don't know if she read them. I don't know if she was allowed to. My aunt kept me updated in the careful way people give you news they know will hurt. Your mother is fine. She had her hip done. She's been gardening. She asks about you sometimes. I never asked what my father said when she asked. Then, in February, my aunt called, and her voice was different this time. Lower, careful. And she said, "Your mom had a stroke. She's in Kelowna General. It's not looking good." I drove up alone, less Seth to finish a filing deadline. My mother was in the neurological unit on the 4th floor, and when I walked in, she was smaller than I remembered, and her left side wasn't moving right. And she looked at me and said my name, just my name, Paige, in the voice she used when I was little, and she'd found me after losing me in a crowd. She died 11 days later. My father was in the room. He didn't acknowledge me when I walked in, and he didn't acknowledge me when I left. But he also didn't call security, which was the thing I'd prepared myself for. Which tells you something about where my baseline was. Seth drove me to Kelowna for the funeral. We stayed at a hotel near the lake, the same stretch of waterfront where my mother used to take me for walks when I was small. I kept thinking I should feel more than I did, but grief is strange. It doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. Sometimes it just sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and still and without edges. The service was at the same church my parents had attended for 30 years. I wore dusty rose. I sat 3 rows back from the front because I wasn't going to make myself invisible, but I also wasn't going to fight for the front pew on this particular day. Seth sat beside me, solid and calm, in the dark blue suit he wears when things matter. My father was at the front. He didn't turn around. The service was what you'd expect. Hymns, readings, a eulogy from a woman at the church who had known my mother through the ladies' auxiliary. She talked about my mother's laugh and her lemon squares and the way she always remembered everyone's birthday. Real things, true things. I was glad for them. When it was over, people moved into the church hall for coffee and sandwiches. I stood near the side door with Seth and my aunt, who kept a gentle hand on my arm the way she'd done since I was a child. That's when my father came across the room. He moved through the small clusters of people with the particular competence of someone who has never questioned his right to occupy space. He stopped in front of me. He looked at Seth briefly, dismissed him in the way he dismisses men he doesn't perceive as useful, and then looked at me. "You shouldn't have come," he said, not loudly, not in a way anyone nearby would have clocked as anything other than a quiet conversation. That had always been his skill. "She was my mother," I said. "She was my wife." He straightened his jacket. "And I'm telling you, as the estate executor, that your presence here is a disruption to the family." My aunt made a small sound beside me. I didn't look at her. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward a man standing near the entrance. I recognized him, vaguely. Some friend of my father's from the local business association, and they spoke briefly. The man nodded once and reached for his phone. 10 minutes later, 2 officers from the RCMP detachment walked in. I want to be honest about what happened in my body at that moment. I've told the story to my therapist, to my aunt, to Seth, and I still feel the same thing every time I get to this part. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something older and colder than fear. The specific feeling of being a child in that house and knowing the rules were going to be applied to you in a way they weren't applied to anyone else. One of the officers, young, professional, clearly uncomfortable with the location, came over and explained that they'd received a call about an unwanted individual on private property. He said it with the tone of someone who wasn't sure he should be there. "Can I ask who placed the call?" I said. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to come with us." "On what grounds?" He glanced at his colleague. "Sir has indicated you're not welcome on this property and has asked that you be removed." I looked at my father across the room. He was watching. He had his arms crossed. I could feel Seth's hand, very briefly, on my lower back. Not restraining, just present. "I'll need to see the documentation authorizing removal," I said. "This is a semi-public event held at a registered place of worship. My father's status as a state executor does not give him authority over church property or over who may attend a funeral service." The officer blinked. I'd had 11 years. 11 years to think about what I would say if something like this ever happened. I'd thought about it more than I'd like to admit. My aunt stepped forward and said, quietly but clearly, that she had also been invited by the deceased, and that she would be placing a call to the church's property manager if this continued. The officer asked if we could step outside to discuss. That's when Seth spoke for the first time. He said it quietly. He said it the way he says everything, without dramatics, without any particular emphasis, just a statement of plain fact. Before we do that, I'd like to identify myself. He reached into his jacket, took out his credentials, and held them where both officers could see. He's been contracted with the British Columbia Securities Commission for the last 3 years. He also holds a standing appointment with the Provincial Financial Crimes Unit. His credentials say exactly that. The atmosphere in the small circle shifted. The officer who'd been speaking to me looked at the credentials, looked at Seth, and said, "Sir, I didn't realize." "That's fine," Seth said. "I want to be helpful here. Can we talk?" They talked. I don't know exactly what was said. Seth keeps that professional composure in a way I've never fully been able to access. But the conversation was brief, and the two officers left without me. They also, I noticed, paused to speak with my father on the way out. He was not looking at me with confidence anymore. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I sat with my aunt. I ate a small triangle of egg salad sandwich because it seemed like the right thing to do. I said goodbye to my mother's ladies' auxiliary friend and thanked her for the eulogy diary. My father left before me. I learned what Seth said to the officers later, in the car on the way back to the hotel. He told them his unit had been conducting a financial review related to an estate in the Okanagan region. He told them he wasn't at liberty to discuss the specifics, but that he would recommend the attending officers document this interaction carefully, given the nature of the review. He told them, in the most collegial possible way, that it might be worth considering whether they wanted their names in the paperwork. The review he mentioned was real. It had been real for 8 months. My grandmother's estate, her actual estate, not just the money she left me, but the property and accounts that had passed to my parents under a separate instrument, had, over the years, been accessed in ways that raised questions. My father had power of attorney over my mother's finances during her illness. He had used that authority to make several significant transfers. He had also, at some earlier point, failed to accurately report certain assets to CRA. Seth had flagged the irregularities more than a year ago, following a professional referral. He had recused himself from the lead investigation because of the family connection. But the investigation had continued without him. I hadn't told my father any of this. I hadn't needed to. 11 years earlier, I'd left that kitchen table with nothing except my grandmother's letter and a very quiet certainty that I would not be destroyed by this. I hadn't known what that meant yet. I just held it like a stone in my pocket, something small and hard to press my thumb against when things were difficult. I built a career in residential real estate law. I learned how powers of attorney work, how estate transfers work, how the money moves and where it goes, and what the paper trail looks like when someone has decided they're the only one who counts. I didn't study those things to plan anything. I studied them because I needed to understand what had been done to me. Seth had found me, not the other way around. I don't want to make this sound more orchestrated than it was. We didn't plan a sting operation at my mother's funeral. We went to say goodbye to her. The rest of it, the officers, the credentials, the investigation that had been running for months in an office in Vancouver, that was just what was already true. Finally being in the same room as my father's certainty that he could still move me. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother's will was filed with the BC Supreme Court Probate Registry. My father was the named executor. That part was as expected. What he had apparently not expected, or had believed he could manage, was the codicil my mother had added in the fall, 18 months before her death, with a notary in Summerland. A notary my father didn't know, an appointment my aunt had driven her to on a Tuesday morning while my father was at a Chamber of Commerce lunch. The codicil directed that a specific portion of the estate, the half-acre on Lakeshore Road that had been in my mother's family since before she married, the property my grandmother had loved and my mother had kept paying taxes on for 32 years, was to pass directly to me. There was also a letter. I won't reproduce what my mother wrote. Some things belong only to the person they were written for, but I will say this, she had known. Not everything, not the details, not the account transfers and the CRA irregularities, but the thing underneath, the way my father treated the people he was supposed to love, the way he had treated me. She had known that for a very long time, and she had done what she could, in the only window she had, to make it right. The notary was required to confirm she had attended the appointment voluntarily and without coercion and without my father present. He confirmed that. The document was clean. My father's lawyer contacted my lawyer in April. There were some preliminary suggestions about contesting the codicil on the grounds of diminished capacity. My lawyer, a very good one, who I had chosen specifically for her work in contested estate litigation, sent back a letter that was polite and thorough and left no ambiguity about how that path would end. We haven't heard from him since. The half-acre on Lakeshore Road has a small house on it, white siding, a porch that needs repainting, a garden my mother kept going until she couldn't anymore. Seth and I drove out to look at it in May. We stood in the backyard and the lake was very blue, and the orchard trees my grandmother planted 60 years ago were starting to come into blossom. And I thought, so this is what she meant. So you'll always have somewhere to stand. I had a conversation recently with a woman I work with. She's going through something with her own family. Different details, same shape. And she asked me how I'd managed to hold on through 11 years of not knowing how it would turn out. I didn't have a good answer for her in the moment, but I've been thinking about it. I think the truth is that I didn't hold on by believing it would be resolved. I held on by deciding, very early and very quietly, that I would not hand my father the version of me that he expected, the one that would keep accommodating, keep adjusting, keep signing things she shouldn't sign. I let him believe that version of me still existed because there was no benefit in correcting him, and because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in an unfair situation is wait and work, and know what you know, and be the kind of person whose husband can pull out his credentials at a church hall in Kelowna and say, completely truthfully, I'd like to identify myself. My mother knew who I was. She left me a piece of land that her mother loved, with a garden she tended for decades, and a letter I will keep for the rest of my life. That's enough. That has always been enough. I just needed to be in the same room as it. I used to think the hardest part of what my father did was the money. $46,000. My grandmother's gift to me, signed away at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning when I was 22 and didn't yet know that love is not the same thing as obligation. But the money wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the years after. The slow realization that he had looked at what he'd taken from me and felt not guilt, but confidence. Like he'd learned something useful about me. Like he'd found a door and made a note of it. That's the thing about people who operate the way my father does. They're not cruel in the dramatic way we imagine cruelty. They're patient. They apply pressure where they know it will yield, and they count on the fact that the people they hurt will be too ashamed, or too uncertain, or too young to understand what happened until it's long done. I was all three of those things at 22. I'm not ashamed of that anymore. What I've come to understand, not through any single moment of clarity, but through 11 years of quiet, deliberate living, is that the choices my father made didn't only shape what happened to him. They shaped what I became. Every decision he made that was small and self-serving sent me further in the opposite direction. His contempt for transparency made me meticulous about documentation. His abuse of legal instruments made me study them until I understood them better than he ever would. His certainty that he was the only one who counted made me build a life with someone who counts everyone equally. He was trying to diminish me. He was building me instead. Seth didn't walk into that church hall in Kelowna with credentials because we planned it. He walked in as himself, the person he'd worked for years to become, doing work that mattered in a field my father had handed him by accident. My father's own choices had created the exact circumstances that undid him. That's not luck. That's not fate in any mystical sense. That's just the way things accumulate over time. The things you do and the things you refuse to do build the ground you're eventually standing on. My mother understood something my father never did. That the quiet acts, the notary appointment on a Tuesday, the codicil no one knew about, the letter she kept until she couldn't anymore, carry as much weight as the loud ones. She couldn't leave the situation she was in, but she did what she could in the window she had, with the integrity she'd held on to for 32 years of marriage to a man who underestimated everyone around him. Gran wrote me a letter when she left me that money. So you'll always have somewhere to stand. I lost the money. I kept the letter. And somehow, through everything, the studio apartment in Kitsilano, the degree I finished on my own, the career I built one careful year at a time, I kept finding somewhere to stand. The half-acre on Lakeshore Road is mine now. The orchard is coming into blossom. There's a porch that needs repainting, and I'm going to paint it myself. In the spring, in whatever color I want. That's the thing, no one can sign away from you if you don't let them. The version of yourself that keeps going anyway. That stays honest when it would be easier not to. That builds something real and waits, without bitterness, for the truth to catch up. It always does.